welcome to this webinar on making technology gender inclusive through GenderMag. I'm very pleased that so many of you decided to attend that and learn a little bit more about gender and technology and how to make it inclusive. And just a little introduction of who I am. So my name is Simone Stumpf. I'm a senior lecturer in the Centre for Human-Computer Interaction Design at City University of London. Some of you might know me already. I've seen some familiar names in the participants list. And my research is obviously, broadly speaking, in human-computer interaction, but my particular focus is on artificial intelligence, AI, personal information management, but then also working in inclusive design and accessibility. And some of these projects combine all four of these interests or a few of these interests. But what I'm talking to you about today, which is the GenderMag method, I've been researching in collaboration with Oregon State University for the last 5 or more years. So I wanted to share our knowledge with you on that. What are we going to cover? So this is going to be a fairly long session. We have 2 hours scheduled. Perhaps we finish a little bit earlier. Depends on how many questions we get, but we have quite a bit of stuff to get through. So I'll be giving you a bit of information on gender and technology, what the issues there are, why gender inclusion matters, not just for your company or organization, but also to wider society. I'll be giving you an introduction to GenderMag, what it is all about, how it works, and then show you how to apply GenderMag, and I'll be showing you an example of how you can actually apply it. Finally, I'll be talking about how you can take GenderMag and embed it into your organization yourself, and then we have some time for questions. Okay, let's start off by discussing why gender and technology matters. In our research that we have done working over the last 5 or so years, we have seen that gender is actually a big problem for technology. We have done work with Microsoft and HP, and we have come across gender inclusion issues in all types of software and all types of technology. So programming environments, websites, mobile apps, e-learning systems, help systems. And more recently, we've also seen those same issues arising in robots and voice assistants. We have done some studies across multiple teams that have used the GenderMag approach. And those teams found on average that 32% of features that they looked at had some gender inclusion issues. So that's roughly a third of features contain some aspects that might be preventing some people from making full use of them. And if you look at that graph on the right, so 32 is the average, but it ranges from as little as 12% to 100%. So the range is quite astounding. But all of what I want you to take away from that is that probably if you start scratching, you'll find gender inclusion issues in your software, in your technology. Let's think a little bit about why there might be these gender inclusion issues. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about gender stereotypes. You probably have all heard or know some of the stereotypes that have found their way into not only society, but also technology. So For example, women are emotional, men are more logical, men are better at maths, women are better at languages, men make great computer scientists, women make great nurses, and of course the old women like pink, men like blue. Where this is also important is that these gender stereotypes have affected some expectations of gender roles throughout society, and technology plays its part in that. So if you think about the genders of doctors and nurses, or bosses and secretaries, what gender comes to mind? Right? Usually, what we tend to find is that when people say, well, a doctor is more likely to be male and a nurse more likely to be female. Bosses are more likely to be male and secretaries are more likely to be female. And what that also has the effect of is that this then gets re-embedded and perpetuated in technology. So if you think about novel technologies such as voice assistants, it's no surprise that the voices of Siri and Alexa are women, right? Because those gender stereotypes get re-embedded in that. We also find that when gender is acknowledged in technology design, what tends to happen is that you get different versions of technology. So technology particularly targeted at women and technology particularly targeted at men. And the reason that you know that this drill is marketed at women is because it is pink, right? So what tends to happen is that aesthetics become genderized, building on these stereotypes that we have of gender. Another stereotype that is often around is that gender is binary. So that you can only choose between male or female. And sometimes that's also built into technology. So by this choice, you might actually constrain the feature sets that you can use. So for example, in gaming, computer games, if you choose, for example, a female character, then you might not get certain traits available to you that allow you to have more strength or other features. I've also seen examples where as soon as you specified your gender as female, for example, certain titles weren't available to you, so you couldn't be a professor anymore. So, it has some wide-ranging ramifications down the line as well, if you just conceive it as sort of these binary choices. I think at this point, I would like to talk about the difference between sex and gender. I referenced gender all the time now, rather than using any sort of binary kind of terms. And so I wanted to cover the background to that, what we currently mean by gender. So currently, what sex is viewed at is biological differences, so something determined by genetic differences that might have physiological implications. So, for example, that females, so people with an XX chromosome, tend to produce some hormones that then cause certain characteristic traits, and a similar thing for males who have XY and therefore start growing beards, right? So it's sex characteristics. So that is what sex is usually seen as. Whereas when we talk about gender, we talk about how we identify, how we define ourselves, and how we behave. And that is very much shaped by cultural and societal expectations. So what is important is that we all have some gender. Society currently tries to or views gender as, you know, men and women. But our gender identity and expression is really along a spectrum. So you can have, you know, you sort of people on the extreme end of a gender spectrum, very much identifying and expressing as a man, and also people on the other side of the spectrum who identify and express very much on the woman side of the spectrum. However, you can have people all the way in between. So, you know, people who might not express their gender as straightforwardly as, you know, on one extreme or the other. So perhaps, you know, less womanly or less feminine and perhaps more masculine. So what does that mean, though, in terms of the impact that that has, right? So I want to sidestep some of the arguments whether gender is done by nature or by nurture. I think the jury is still out on that one. It seems that most research seems to indicate that it's heavily shaped by society, by nurture. But also research has shown that there are differences between genders and their technology use, and that's what I want to focus on here. So whether you believe that they are inborn or built through society, what that means is that if you don't account for these differences, people, users of your technology, every time they you know, use your product or services, if they're not designed to account for these differences, they have to pay a cognitive tax, right? They have to work much harder to use them. And that's what we really want to avoid. So previous research has shown that there are differences in perception of vision and sound. I think a very common example is, for example, color blindness. So about 10% of men are colorblind. Only a fraction of women are colorblind, for example. But there are also differences in language and communication styles that have been found in previous research. A aspect that I want to return to in more detail later is information processing styles, so that different genders process information slightly differently, and that can lead to impacts down the line of how they use and overcome some issues as well. There are some differences in terms of attitudes to risk, how risk averse or risk seeking genders are. A big topic is self-confidence and also what is called self-efficacy. What that is the belief in your ability to succeed certain tasks, not necessarily related to any actual performance or actual ability to succeed. And then also there have been differences found in the reasons for using technology. And again, I'll return to that later. One thing I wanted to point out, because it counters common stereotypes, is that there's no evidence of any differences based on intelligence. So there's no smarter gender. There's no difference in drive to succeed. So going for that promotion is definitely an equal drive amongst genders. And there's also been no differences found more recently on mathematical ability. Okay. So let me go on to why gender inclusion matters. So first of all, I think if you are working in an organization that is for profit, this is something that really is close to your heart, because if you're not designing with gender inclusion in mind, that has an impact on your ability to for selling and making a profit. So it has an impact on the market and market potential. So roughly there is an equal split between men and women in the worldwide population. And research has also shown that women make up more than 50% of the market for some applications. So if you are looking at this graphic over here, this table, we see that many more women are actually using apps, spending more money on apps, and that also they tend to use certain kinds of apps much more frequently. On the other hand, you have some apps and software that typically men are very attracted to. So travel apps and navigation apps, games and business apps. So there's not necessarily a sort of equal gender split across the use of technology. So if you have gender inclusion issues in your technology, then potentially you have created a weaker user experience for half or more than half of your target market by disadvantaging them. And that goes as much as for women as for men. So if you're actually excluding or not including men in your considerations, then that would also have the same ramifications. Also, what that means is you wasted the time of your team to capture your target market's attention and market potential. So that is an argument that by increasing gender inclusion, you're actually seeing a benefit down on the bottom line of your profit. However, if we're turning towards wider society, then gender inclusion is really the right thing to do. If we don't design to include all genders, then we might actually impair one section of society's ability to achieve their goals. So you can't actually do the things that you want to do. We can also cause an imbalance in participation, knowledge and skills throughout this society. So by excluding or not making it gender inclusive, we're also having these more far-reaching implications on education, career choices, perhaps also recruitment into STEM fields and disciplines, and perhaps your own hiring practices. I think also what you need to bear in mind is that by not considering gender inclusion, we just perpetuate and reinforce these stereotypes. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that if we don't design for gender inclusion, then there will be no gender inclusion, and we're just doing the same old thing over and over. But remember, what we don't want to do is to use the pink it and shrink it approach. So the point of this, of gender inclusion, is not to build different versions of your products. different versions that appeal to women or men. What we're trying to do by including or gender inclusion is including everyone, right? So we want to do one version that lets everyone have a great user experience. Okay, and at this point, I can take some questions if there are any questions already. If not, we can just move on and have more time for questions later.
Hi, Simone. I think we had one question from Yaz about one of the slides. And there was a question about a source on the slide with the splits of gender by apps. Do you?
Yeah.
Oh. Something you can.
Yeah, let me just go back to it. This one. Yeah. So that is a table that we collated in one of our research publications, and that came from a variety of sources that talked about the gender split in application use. That was mainly based on market research reports. I can so in the GenderMag booklet, the e-booklet, there's a list of resources that is available, and that graphic or that table comes from one of the research publications. So I can send the reference to that publication.
I think that was the only question, Simone. I know you mentioned the booklet. Have we said anything more about that, or we'll be doing that later?
We can do that later, but if we're talking about it, I can just mention it. So after the webinar, probably a couple of days after the webinar, we're sending out an email inviting you to take part in a survey, giving us feedback about this webinar, but also providing you with a link to download the GenderMag e-booklet, which has these slides in it and more information. So we quite often refer to that as the GenderMag kit. So, you know, there's lots of resources in there as well.
I've just seen that we have a new question, Simone. I don't know if this is regarding the same slide, but there's a question come from Mimi about if there were similar stats with regards to queer people.
I haven't really come across that. That's a really good question. The research tends to be currently restricted to broad categories. So a lot of research that was done previously, for example, will split people up into men and women, not other kind of gender characterizations or identities. So there's very thin information on the ground from that regard. And then when we go into, say, something like sexual orientation, there's even less data available that allows us to do that. However, I think it's a great avenue for further user research to actually think a little bit more about the makeup of your target audience.
I don't see any other questions at the present time, but if anyone has any further questions, feel free to post them in the chat, either to me or to everyone.
Okay, great. I'll go on to the next topic, which is I'll give you an introduction to what GenderMag actually is. So I mentioned before, we've done quite a lot of research on GenderMag. It's been around for a few years now. It has gone through several iterations. So we refined it over the years to make it very easy to use. We also validated it with various organizations who have used it. I mentioned Microsoft and HP, but there's other organizations that have used it as well. It's a very, we hope, easy to use, but structured approach for evaluating and then fixing technology products and services. It really has three parts, and I'll go through them in turn in a little bit more detail. So the first thing is what we call the 5 facets, and those are a set of cognitive styles for using technology or for technology use. And those different facets have some clustering according to different genders, and I go through those in a minute. The second part, or the second aspect of GenderMag, is that we use a set of personas that are pre-prepared, and these personas have a particular value for each of these facet values, or for the 5 facets, and then also some characteristics and background to bring them to life. So they're like real personas, but we have the facets baked into them. And the final aspect of GenderMag is that we have something called an evaluation walkthrough. And that is how you actually apply the facets and the personas to your own technology products and services. So we use the evaluation walkthrough to find gender inclusion issues using these personas. And again, I'll have an example of how you can do that. So let's talk about the 5 facets first of all. What is really important to understand is that these facets are tendencies of behaviors along a spectrum. So everyone will differ according to these different behaviors, and it's not meant to essentialize. So it's not that all women behave like this end of the spectrum and not all men behave like this other end of the spectrum. What we tend to see is a little bit like this graph. So we have a spectrum of behavior, perhaps from low to high or the other way around. And women tend to sort of cluster towards one end, but there are some women who are very much in this kind of side of the spectrum, and men might cluster sort of more towards the other end. And, you know, we have some things in between that might indicate that you have more genders or people that are just somewhere in the middle. I said there are 5 facets, and I think now is the right point to go through these different facets. And the first facet that I want to talk about is information processing style. So to solve problems with technology, people need to look at and understand new information, right? So when they encounter some technology, they will have to understand how to use it. If they want to do something with that technology, they also have to understand what the process is. So previous research has shown that men tend to do something what is called a selective information processing style. So what they tend to do is to select promising leads of information and then backtrack if they need to, if something doesn't quite work out. What women tend to do, or and how they use technology is that they gather information more comprehensively. So they have a comprehensive information processing style. So they tend to like to collect a fairly complete set of information and then proceed. Right. So it's not necessarily that one is better than the other. It's really just completely different styles of behavior that shapes how people use technology. The second facet is the learning style for new technology. So when you are trying to figure out how to use new technology, how do you proceed? So in our research, we have seen that men were much more likely than women to tinker. And by tinkering, we mean that they playfully experiment with a piece of technology to figure out how it works, right? And we see that quite often when people use new technology, that they start figuring out how to use it by just pushing all the buttons and trying to see what happens if they push a button. Where do they get to next? Whereas women were much more likely to follow a process when it came to learning. So, you know, they wanted a sort of more structural approach to learning rather than just playing around with the technology. However, there is a cautionary aspect there. So it's not enough to say, well, women don't like to tinker. It is that they tend not to, but when they do, they also do it differently. So they tend to do so more mindfully than men, more purposefully. And when they did tinker and did this mindful tinkering, then they learned more as well. So again, a different approach to figuring out how new technology works, what you can do with it. The third facet is about computer self-efficacy, and I already mentioned that a little bit in the beginning. So this is about a person's self-confidence or confidence that they'll succeed at a specific task using technology. So why is it so important? So it actually affects whether a person is more likely to give up on a task if they encounter obstacles, and also how they cope when presented with obstacles, right? So it is perhaps somebody who has low computer self-efficacy might actually say, well, I'm no good anyway. I'll never succeed at doing this with technology, so I might as well give up now rather than continuing to use this technology. And research, and not just our research, has shown that men tended to have higher computer self-efficacy than women. So if something goes wrong in the technology, they don't blame themselves because they have the confidence to, or they think they have, they'll succeed at that task. They actually are more likely to blame the technology itself rather than themselves. Okay, the fourth facet is about attitudes to risk. So research has shown again and again that women tend to be more risk averse than men, and not just in terms of technology, but also more widely. What that means for technology use is that women may not engage with certain technology or certain technology feature sets, as they think that, you know, they might waste their time, the risk is too high to use this technology, and, you know, they might end up somewhere where they have to sort of spend lots of time to get themselves back from. So it's really important to also think about that in combination with learning new technology. You know, what is their attitude towards the risk of investing time in learning this new technology. And then finally, we have motivations, and that is about the reasons for using technology. So what we have seen in previous research is that the tendency amongst men is that to use technology for the sake of technology, right? So the enjoyment of technology just by itself. Whereas women tended to use technology more because they had a particular task to carry out. They had a specific goal in mind that they wanted to achieve. Okay. So these were the 5 facets. Now I wanted to introduce you to the second aspect of GenderMag, which is the personas. Just in case you're not familiar with what a persona is, if you're not from a UX background, for example. So a persona is a fictitious but research-grounded archetype of a user of a technology product or service. So they look and sound like real people. They have their own sets of backgrounds and behaviors. They usually have a picture and some descriptions around it. And as I said, they're archetypes, so they're stand-in representations of certain user groups, and they're often used in UX. So if you're coming from a UX background, I'm sure you have come across personas before. And what GenderMag does is that we have a set of personas that we use in the evaluation of technology and sort of consider them against these 5 facets, right? So GenderMag has 3 personas, Abby, Tim, and Pat, and you can see them on the right here. Here we have Tim, that who represents one end of the spectrum. Abby is kind of the other end of the spectrum, and then we have Pat, who represents those people in the middle. So we have all of the spectrum of behaviors, the 5 facets represented here. Each of these personas has a customizable backstory. So, you know, you can change them, you can change their names, you can change their personal details, their ages, where they live, what they do for a living, or what their interests are. So they are really designed to work across a wide range of settings. You can customize them to your own use. Most importantly, each persona has some facet characteristics. So these facet values that are characteristic to that end of the spectrum, and those are research backed. So that means we have evidence that this is actually true. We didn't make it up. So I wanted to introduce you to the 3 personas. Let's do Abby first. So her behavior reflects facet values commonly seen in women during research. So she would have high risk aversion, low self-efficacy, a comprehensive information processing style, and so on. So you will see on the right, this is Abby. She has a picture. She also has these little 3 pictures, and that is just to remind people that, you know, there might actually be some men who are very much like Abby, because it is a spectrum of behavior. So it doesn't just affect just women, but a range of different people. We have the background story of Abby in our example here. She's 28. She works as an accountant, and she lives in Cardiff in Wales. She has a little kind of life backstory. She has some backgrounds and skills. And then most importantly, there's this section, which is how we embody the facets and the facet characteristics in the personas. So here we have more information about her motivations, her computer self-efficacy, her attitude towards risk, and also her information processing style, and whether she learns by process or more by tinkering. So all of these are sort of baked in, right? When you're doing a GenderMag evaluation, you probably are going to use Abby a lot, because usually technology is not designed for people like Abby. Now, Abby is one end of the spectrum of behavior, and she is really the opposite of Tim. So let's have a look a little bit at Tim. So Tim represents facet values that are really strongly associated with men. So in research, a lot of men tended to display that kind of behavior or kind of style. So if you look at the persona, you will see that actually their background story is very much the same. So you know, there's hardly any difference, right? They're all still 28 years old, working as an accountant, living in Cardiff and Wales. Where differences come in is, again, in these motivations and attitudes. So, for example, Tim has a very high confidence in his abilities with technology, so high computer self-efficacy. He doesn't mind taking risks. He has a selected information processing style, and he likes to tinker with products and services to figure out how they work. I'll come onto this in a minute, but there's certain things that you can and can't change, but significantly, these aspects here are preset, the motivations and attitudes and how Tim or the different personas work with technology and how they learn. And then finally, we have Pat. And if you remember, Pat represents all of these users somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. So they are designed to cover the large fraction of users, men and women, who don't fit Abby's or Tim's behavior profile. Right? So they have a little bit of a mix of these facet characteristics. For example, in terms of computer self-efficacy, they have medium kind of computer self-efficacy. They tend to be perhaps more risk averse, but then they also like to gather information more comprehensively. But they might like to tinker a little bit more and then do it more purposefully. Again, the background doesn't vary. They have exactly the same profile, and it's just the alignment against the facet values that changes. So I mentioned that before, there's certain things you can and can't change in our personas. The highlighted yellow bits are the things that you cannot change. They are set in the persona because they are research backed, but everything else you can change. So there's only a very few places that you can't make changes to customize it to your own setting. Okay, I'll take a few questions again, if there are any.
If anyone has any questions, please post them on the channel. But at the moment, Simone, it doesn't look like there was any questions from anyone at the moment.
Okay, all right. So there will be more opportunities to ask questions. You know, anything that comes to mind, pop it into the chat channel. But I'll just go on and then show you how to apply GenderMag. So we have gone through the 5 facets. We now know what the personas are. So how to actually use the personas in the evaluation. And the way that GenderMag does it is that we use something called a GenderMag walkthrough, but it is actually built on top of something that you might have come across before if you're from a usability or UX background, which is called a cognitive walkthrough. So what a cognitive walkthrough is that we don't do user testing directly with users, but instead we conduct a walkthrough of perhaps a paper prototype or even a sketch or an implemented interface that enables experts or non-users to find issues. Right, problems with the interface. And a cognitive walkthrough works by asking a very defined set of questions at particular points during the walkthrough. So that then helps the evaluator to figure out whether a user would be able to use the issue or whether there's a problem with using the issue or function in question. So what we've done is we've taken a cognitive walkthrough and made it part of the GenderMag evaluation, but built in our personas into this process. So I just explain how we do that. So there's 2 stages really of the GenderMag walkthrough, and the first one is that you obviously need to prepare for the walkthrough. So there are 4 steps here. In step 1, you tend to choose, or you choose your technology that you want to evaluate, and then also the specific use case that you want to evaluate. That usually means, well, what sets of functions that that you want to evaluate that have a certain purpose, right, or achieve a certain thing in your technology. It's important to scope that wisely because the GenderMag walkthrough is quite a detailed technique. It's a very powerful technique, but it works best if you scope it so you don't make that use case too big. So if you're thinking of running a GenderMag walkthrough on the entirety of, say, your user interfaces, you wouldn't really need to chop that up into various bits, and that is where you would select the use case. In the next step, you choose a persona and customize it. So you would perhaps choose Abby or Tim. If it's your first walkthrough, I would advise you usually stick with Abby and you customize that persona to your particular circumstances. So make the background and the background story fit your use case and also your user group, your target user group. In the next step, step 3, you would arrange the details of your walkthrough. So you would schedule your walkthrough. Usually that takes about 2 hours for a typical use case. And you might have an evaluation team that you want to invite to conduct the evaluation with you. So perhaps 3 to 5 people. If you don't have that, then you can also do it by yourself in a pinch. But getting more eyes on a problem is usually, or an interface is usually a good idea. So I would suggest having more than one person conduct that walkthrough. In step 4, you just make sure that you have all of your materials set up, and we also have developed some reporting forms that help you with the walkthrough, but also recording the issues. And I have a little example of those. So we have 2 types of forms: the sub-goal report form and the action report form. And the sub-goal report form details the current use case, the current sub-goal. So there might be a series of sub-goals that need to be achieved in order to complete the use case. And then it has the right question that you need to ask. And so you would customize that and fill in your persona name here. And then this part will be actually used in the walkthrough. After you evaluate sub-goals, you would evaluate actions, and we have report forms for those as well, and they're in two parts, before and after. So within a sub-goal, you would carry out certain actions, and you ask certain questions either before or after the action is taken. So before, for example, a button is clicked, you need to ask, will this persona, will Abby, for example, do this? And after the button is clicked, will Abby know that they did the right thing and are making progress towards the goal? So again, these parts are for recording when you're carrying out the walkthrough. Once you have prepared and your walkthrough is scheduled, on the day you would do the evaluation part. So the first step in that is you would write down your use cases sub-goals. So what are the different goals, the different things that need to be achieved to complete that use case? In the second and third steps, you're working your way down the list of the sub-goals. So in the second step, we would evaluate whether that persona would have thought of doing this sub-goal. And then in step 3, we're evaluating the actions that they would take to achieve the sub-goal. And again, you ask that before the action is taken and after, before they're taking the action and after performing the action. That will become much clearer when I show an example of how to do it. So just bear with me a second. In step 4, once you have done all that and you have cycled your way through step 2 and 3, you would debrief with the team. You would look through the reporting forms and see how many issues you have found, what the kinds of issues were, and then figure out perhaps how to prioritize and how to resolve them. So let me take you through an example walkthrough. Let's just say that I'm going to evaluate some learning technology, and I'm going to use Abby as my first persona for this. So what I would do is I would take the persona and change that slightly. So I would make clear that she's a computer science lecturer teaching a module called CS 567. And then my use case would be that I want to make a captioned instructional video available to her CS 567 students. So I want to share some video. That is my use case. And perhaps I want to say that it's somewhere, she has been told that it's somewhere like in the My Media space on Canvas. And Canvas is the virtual learning environment that the university uses, right? So once I have done that, I have customized it. I would have customized all of my reporting forms as well. I get my team together to evaluate, and I would list a sub-goal. So to achieve sharing the captioned video, Abby wants to get to it, so she needs to get to the right location, and then she needs to make it available to a student, so she needs to somehow publish it. Okay. So there's only 2 sub-goals here, but depending on a different use case, there might be more. It might be a more complex step. Okay, this is the Canvas login. Usually we do not evaluate standard kind of login screens because they're very common. They're not that complex. Just assume that you have those details, and also if you see on here somewhere that the user is called somebody like Anita, just assume that is Abby's login. Okay, so the first thing is that Abby would see this. The use case is share captioned video with her students. The sub-goal is get to the captioned video. And we're asking here, well, will Abby have thought of this as a step towards achieving the overall use case? This is what you would be paying attention to during an evaluation. So you would have your persona alongside you, so that everybody can refer back to the persona until they're very familiar with the persona. And you would just answer that question, will Abby have thought of this as a step towards achieving the overall use case, and think like Abby, right? So would she have thought of this as a step towards achieving the overall goal? Yes, maybe, or no. Probably, I would personally take yes. She probably will have thought of that as a step towards achieving the overall use case because she probably knows that, you know, that Canvas is the way to do that. During the evaluation, you are encouraged to consider different facets. So these are the motivations, information processing style. And if you think that the reason for answering yes is one of these facets, then you can tick them. You can also tick none of the above. And then you can give some more detailed reason why you think that this applies, or why you think that Abby would do this. So you can probably sort of do that as we follow along if you think that Abby would have done this, and I show you the rest of the process now. So once she has logged in, Abby would end up on this screen. So that's the sort of home screen, right? After her login. And as part of the first sub-goal, get to the captioned video, the action that she needs to do is to click on account. Right? So a designer of the system would have designed a path through the interface to achieve that particular sub-goal. So, right, so this is the correct action for Abby to take. It's what the designer wants her to do, right? Or wants a user, not particularly Abby, to do. So before we take the action to click on account, we need to ask, well, will Abby do this, right? So her sub-goal is still to get to the captioned video, and she now has to click on account, and we're asking, will she do this? I would guess, right, knowing Abby, that she will probably not click on account. Because she is going to not tinker with any of the buttons to figure out what to do. I think she might think, okay, what's going to happen when I click on all of these different buttons? So I would probably take learning and attitude to risk and no, and just give a little explanation here of why I think that is not going to happen. Okay, so once the account is selected, we're going to end up on this. So this slide out has happened. And at that point, I'm going to do the second part of the action evaluation. So after she clicked on the account, will Abby know that she did the right thing and that she is making progress towards the goal? So in this case, I think that probably either maybe or yes, she would know that she's making progress, because she has been told that she needs to look out for something called My Media, and she's quite likely to see it here, right? So if she remembers that it's somewhere to be found in My Media, then I think yes. You could say, well, perhaps not, or maybe. But again, you would select an answer and really sort of think about, okay, what facets have you considered? And it's fine to tick none of the above as well. Okay, next part. So we have that. So now she needs to click on My Media. So before I do that, will Abby do this? I think yes. She has seen it. She knows that is where she needs to head towards. So I think that she would be quite happy to carry on. Once she has done that, she ends up on this screen, the My Media screen. And to get to that's the part 2. So after she has clicked on My Media, will she know that she has done the right thing and has made progress towards their goal? Again, I think because she can see that this is the stats demo video that she was after, she would probably know that she's on the right track. So I would tick yes, and I would probably go, well, that probably has nothing to do with any of the facets. It's none of the above. Okay, so now she's at that video. She needs to make it available. So at the start of each new sub-goal, we go back to the sub-goal evaluation form or reporting form. So now her sub-goal is make it available. We think, will Abby have thought of this as a step towards achieving the overall use case? I think yes. She needs to she probably understands that she has to make it, share it in some kind, or make it available to students to share it. So again, yes. Now we're back into the action reporting, that kind of cycle or step in the evaluation. So now what she has to do is she has to tick this checkbox here. Right? That is what the designer of the system wants her to do. So before she ticks that checkbox, will Abby do this? Now ask yourself what you would do yourself, but also think through Abby. So would she tick that checkbox, yes, maybe, or no? Again, I think the likelihood is that she probably wouldn't tick this checkbox because, again, she doesn't like to tinker. She doesn't want to, go down a route of selecting one thing and then going on until she has to backtrack. So there's probably information processing style, definitely the learning by process, and her low or her risk averseness in play here. Once she has done that, will Abby know that she has made progress? Again, I think it's not really obvious that she's making any progress towards it. Again, probably because she likes to just gather all of that information up in beforehand before taking any sort of next action. So she probably wouldn't end up this far. Okay. Once she has selected the tick box, she needs to click on that actions drop-down, which is over here. Again, we ask before she does that, will Abby do this? I would possibly say maybe. You know, she might have become familiar with sort of an action button. She might not see it because it's quite it's faint on a white background, it fades into the background. So there might be a mixture of reasons like, you know, again, her risk averseness, her information processing style, but also something which doesn't really neatly fit into these facets. And then I would also tick this box. So once I have done that, I need to click on this action drop down. I can ask the question, will Abby know that she has made progress? Probably at this point she would know because that publish drop down appeared. And so I would say yes. And that ends up here. So in the third part, or third action, part 1, she needs to select publish. Again, I think she would do that at that point. And then she ends up here where we can ask, well, will she know that she has made progress? And probably by that point she will. Okay, so that was a little peek in how you would apply the GenderMag process walk through to a small use case. You can see that this is quite detailed, right? So there are certain ground rules that you have to follow to make it a success. So the first thing to remember is that you need to stay true to the persona. So you always ask the question from the perspective of, will the persona, will Abby, Tim, or Pat do this? It's not what you would do, or somebody else in the team would do, or somebody else that you know, right? You need to follow that sequence. And I know it might seem very laborious, but the issue is that you want to uncover and find these gender inclusion issues. And they really you know, work on these little steps. So there's no broad brush kind of evaluation or heuristics. We don't have them yet. We really need to follow the path of a user, how the user would behave to apply and find, apply the GenderMag process and find these issues. So don't try and predict a sequence of events that the persona might do. It's actually what you or a designer or a developer wants the persona to do. So you have designed the user interface. So there is a certain path through the interface, and that is what we're evaluating. We want to answer every question because every question gives us a bit more information along the way of how far they would have come and where the problems are. Even if you think that your persona would have given up by that point, probably in that previous example that I showed, I would have personally given up by point, you know, by action 2. But just pretend your persona has come along with it through some magic and answer all of the questions and all parts of the sequence. Another point to remember is that you just want to find the issues in the first place, right? Don't try and fix the issues during the walkthrough. Don't design on the fly. Just wait until you're finished and you have the full picture of what the gender issues might be. If you are evaluating this in a team, you do not have to agree with each other. In fact, it's really good to find all of the possible issues that might arise. So if there are different perspectives, different answers. Some people might have said yes, some people said no, some people maybe in the evaluation team. Then just count them all in. It's really likely that if one person has thought of this as a potential issue, then perhaps another real user would have also come across this. Okay, I have time for some questions. Do we have any?
Hi, Simone. Yes, we had quite a few questions come through. So I don't know if we could go back to the section about personas. We should start there. We had a few come in just as we were starting on this section. There was just a question there from Jillian about non-binary gender personas. Have you looked into or used those? I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, so in a way, it's really about the facet values, right? We don't care that much about the gender identity or the expression of the in the persona. Actually, what is interesting that I just put up Pat. Pat started or represents all of these different people in the middle. So they could be women, they could be men, or they could be people who identify as non-binary. It's more important to think about it as a certain point along the spectrum that has these combinations of facet values, right? And so you could actually treat Pat as somebody who's non-binary. That is completely up to you.
Okay, and then we had also another question about whether or not intersectionality comes into play with any of these personas. So any kind of influences from race or culture or age or perhaps disability.
So that's a really interesting point. So at the moment, GenderMag focuses on gender. However, we also know that some of these facets intersect with other backgrounds and characteristics. So, for example, gender and race. We know, for example, that attitudes to risk is affected by both gender and race. So we call this the white male effect. White males tend to be very much less risk averse than, say, Black men or Black and white women. So while we haven't embedded this into GenderMag, that is a really good question. We're also working on integrating intersectional aspects into our personas as we go along.
Okay, I think you might have touched on this a bit more, but we had a question about whether the persona behavior was biological or learned. Did you want to say anything more about that?
So yeah, that's a question that we often get, and I think we quite often in our work take a very pragmatic approach and say, well, we don't quite know who is right, whether that it's nature or nurture. All we know is that there are some differences, and we don't know what causes them. Personally, I think the evidence suggests that there might be some things that might be very much essential, but they're very, very few. There might be some sex-linked characteristics that come into play, but the vast majority of differences seems to be that it is enculturated. So it's caused by expectations and things that are really caused or practiced very early on. So that actually causes a lot of the differences. The reason why I think that is that actually studies that have investigated gender differences have found different results over the years. So for example, spatial abilities used to be that men were much better at spatial abilities than women, and now the difference is almost gone. So I think there's a change happening that is sort of causing differences to disappear over time as well.
Okay, that's really neat. So those were all the questions that we had about the personas for the time being. So now we had quite a few questions about the next section. I don't know if we'll have time to answer all of them right now, but there was some questions around conducting the cognitive walkthrough yourselves, around the bias and how practical it really is to get people who are actually working on the software to do the cognitive walkthrough, and what can we do about team bias?
Right. I think that is where really our departure from the traditional cognitive walkthrough comes into play. So the traditional cognitive walkthrough is by an expert who interprets or acts on behalf of the user. So in a way, the expert needs to know quite a lot about the user. And there's also the danger of the bias of the expert just interpreting certain actions. So what we have done is to counteract this bias of interpreting issues of evaluators thinking of their own behavior is to introduce these personas. So all of the questions we're asking are from the perspective of a particular persona. So during a walkthrough, you would have perhaps Abby next to you, printed out on a big sheet or several sheets, so everybody can refer back to Abby, and we're forcing people to really think like Abby does, even though it might not be their own behavior. The second thing that avoids bias is that we want an evaluation team, and I mentioned it later on, is that we're not looking for consensus in the team about the yes, maybe, or no, or even the facets. So what you can do is after this evaluation, you would have a debrief. You would take all of these forms and from that have been filled out by the team, and you would just count how many maybes and no's there are, right? And all of the no's indicate a gender inclusion issue, and also some of the maybes where there's potentially a problem and you might want to dig a little bit deeper. So it doesn't matter whether everyone agrees that that is a problem. It's again very likely that if one person in the team thinks that that is a problem, then probably it's a problem for at least one user or potentially more.
Okay, I'm not sure which question to jump to next. So we had some questions about the team itself. Yeah, maybe let's do that. So we've got a question here from Aga about, is it better to do it as a team exercise, or should each evaluator do it separately and then the group should evaluate it together?
We actually suggest that people do it as a team, as a group. So you can project the prototype perhaps on the screen. Everybody can look at it. You know, people can take on different roles, and in the e-booklet we have some suggestions about how you can split up different roles in a team. So it's not you know, that you have to keep the evaluators separate and they have to go their own way. In the case of current lockdowns, you might have to do that. But you don't have to. It's actually, it works quite well doing as a team, talking things through, getting a different perspective, and also making sure that people really stay focused on the persona as a team.
Okay, and also from Agos, a question about when you're going through this, would you use all three personas?
Okay, so during a particular or specific walkthrough where you're evaluating a use case, you only use one persona. So you wouldn't have all three present because it just gets a bit too confusing. So if you wanted to evaluate the same use case, but with different personas, you would have different kind of sessions where you focus on the behavior of a particular persona. So you have a session where you're looking at Abby and a session where you look at Tim, that kind of thing.
Okay. All right. And then just to skip back to this question that we had from Jillian, really just on a fundamental level here, the question about the benefit between doing this kind of cognitive walkthrough with your team versus actually doing usability tests. And then tied into that is, could you tweak this to make this, bring these facets into a recruitment screener and then run usability testing instead? Do you want to say something about that, Simone?
Yeah, that is a brilliant question, because obviously I think usability testing or user testing is still the gold standard. That's what you want to head towards. However, I think it's quite difficult in this respect. So usually you might run user testing with 5-10 users maybe. Here, what you would have to do is a sort of gender balance. Also think about, have you got these different styles and behaviors represented in your participants. So this is really a quick way to uncover these gender inclusion issues. So if you're using the cognitive walkthrough, absolutely, if you can use these personas to drive recruitment of participants if you wanted to for user testing, to kind of see, okay, what facets would I have to cover, and how would I figure out whether a particular participant might be representing people like Abby. So you could do that as well, but we're not in competition with usability testing or user testing. This is just a, I wouldn't call it a discount technique, but a technique that you can use even if you don't have access to users.
Okay, so we had quite a few questions here from Debashri. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but I think we've gone through, I think you've mentioned quite a bit of this. So a question really about, would you use GenderMag for the entire product?
Not all at once. So I probably would do that for aspects of the user interface to start off with, and actually in the next bit I've got lined up, I'm going to talk a little bit about hints and tips how to do it yourself, what to look out for. So one recommendation is prioritize. So perhaps within your product or service, you have a particular section that is especially important, focus on that first. Cover that going through with GenderMag and seeing if you can actually spot some problems there. And if you fix it, then you have really made a good start to making it easier for everyone to use your product.
Okay. And then tied in with this, and I don't know if you've mentioned this, but just thinking about the workshop where you go through the walkthrough with your teammates, about how many hours would you expect that to run for?
We usually reserve about 2 hours, and that's including the debrief. It depends how big the use case is, how many sub goals there are, how many actions you have to take. So if you think about it, this is at the action level. So clicking stuff, pushing buttons, selecting something, entering something. So it is quite detailed. So we usually suggest to keep the use case relatively well scoped, but usually you can do it in a couple of hours.
Okay, and I think you sort of touched on this too around, could you merge the questions with when you go through this? Does that compromise things?
Yeah, I wouldn't merge the questions. So you really so each question uncovers a different aspect of what might be problematic. So a sub-goal question uncovers whether they would have gotten that far in the first place, right? Would they have struggled at the first hurdle, right? The action ones also uncover different issues or different aspects of issues. So will the persona do this, right? Is much more about will they know what the next sequence is, right? Can they figure that out? Whereas the second part of that question, will they know that they're making progress, is more about, is the feedback on what they have just done sufficient, or will they be lost? So it's really important to not skip any of the questions, not combine them, because they just look at different kinds of aspects of the sequence as you go along.
I think I've covered off everyone's questions, or if I had a question about your question, I've sent you a message privately. If you've got any other questions, please just post them in the session, the chat channel, and yeah, I think that's it for now.
Okay, right. I shall go on. This next section is actually quite short, so it's really about how can you take GenderMag into your organization and use it. So some tips and advice. Really, we think that anyone, any organization that designs technology, whether it's hardware, software, or the web, could use it. But there are some tips that we have gathered along the way that might make it easier. And the first tip is really about finding a champion. So usually what you want is that somebody at a higher level of management, somebody who can make decisions about what processes to adopt, needs to be supportive of GenderMag, has an interest in gender inclusion and actually cares about it. I think we've seen similar things, for example, in accessibility, where organizations have decided top down that accessibility for people with impairments, for example, is very important to them, and then it gets integrated. And we see the same thing happening with GenderMag, where somebody at perhaps the executive level needs to make a decision that this is the direction that they want to take. So it's good to have a champion, to get somebody really invested into this process. The second tip is, and that is really nice because it relates back to the questions that I just answered as well, is try and embed GenderMag into your existing processes and practices. And that can be all the way through UX and design, accessibility, and also QA. So if you think about usability evaluations, right, try and make GenderMag part of it. So if you have, for example, a heuristic evaluation of a design, try and sort of do GenderMag as perhaps an add-on process to that. If you are conducting user testing, perhaps use GenderMag to inform some of the recruitment that you have, or some of the questions that you might ask. Really sort of think, how can you improve your UX and design practices with GenderMag? I think also this has an interesting relationship with accessibility. So if you already have some procedures to, for example, test for WCAG compliance or doing some audits, then you could think about, well, how would GenderMag fit into this as well? So you can add this on into your accessibility evaluations. And then finally, also think about it as part of quality assurance, so Q&A and testing. So quite often and very early on, we viewed these gender inclusion issues as bugs, right? So if you think of them as another bug in your software that you need to sort out, then you can sort of think about, okay, how can I include the GenderMag approach and perhaps personas or you know, these different processes, walkthroughs into the QA process. Another tip is that you can use what we call GenderMag moments. So if you've perhaps already carried out some evaluations using GenderMag, then you can run these on-the-spot checks. Right? As you're designing or developing a solution, you can ask, well, will Abby do this? Why would they do that? If they do this thing, will they know that they're making progress towards their goal? Why is that? And then you can just have use the answers to these questions as design checks and also inspirations to fix it on the spot, or actually add it to the design backlogs. We have a whole list of different best practices. There's actually a leaflet on that you can download. And again, I have some details on that in the e-booklet. But let me just run through them bit by bit. So I think this goes for any kind of usability evaluations, and GenderMag is no exception, that you want to do this as early as possible. So if you find gender inclusion issues and fix them during the design phase, then obviously you don't need to redevelop later. So you can run GenderMag on sketches, paper prototypes, clickable wireframes. So you don't have to wait until you have an implemented interface to find these issues. It might be a good idea to have a designated sub-team to carry out GenderMag walkthroughs, at least in the beginning, because it takes some investment to get to grips with the personas, how to do the walkthroughs, what questions to do, get the whole process smooth. And so it sometimes is good if you have a dedicated sub-team that knows how these personas work, that almost has them memorized, to actually do these walkthroughs again and again. I mentioned earlier that probably you will be using Abby quite a lot. and particularly on one of your first walkthroughs using that on your own technology and own use cases, we would suggest to use Abby first, because what tends to happen is that currently most technology designs actually are not, they are overlooking people like Abby. Or at least cognitive styles that Abby displays. This is probably because most designers and developers are a little bit more like Tim at the moment. So we really suggest that you try Abby first. What can also be a good idea is that there's often multiple ways to get from one point in the interface to another point. So you have various paths through the interface that achieve the same thing. What you can do is you can actually carry out multi-path evaluations. So in your walkthrough session, you could say, okay, we are going to try this path first, this sequence first, and then there might be another sequence to get from here to there as well, and let's evaluate that. And then you can compare, is there one way that's easier perhaps for Abby or not? Somebody asked about, can you do that on the whole of your technology? And my answer was, well, you would take little bites of it to get there. And I think this really speaks to that. So if you focus on commonly used UI patterns, for example, that you're using over and over again in your interface, if there's certain sequences that happen over and over again, if you find and fix gender inclusion issues in them, then you have a really quick big win, right? Because you sort out a lot of issues all at the same time if you fix that common UI pattern. Really important is the debrief after the GenderMag walkthrough, so where you count how many issues you have. There you want to just count it and also perhaps start to identify fixes. That might mean that you have to categorize fixes, and their feasibility. So what is it actually affecting? Is it a fundamental kind of thing that you need to change in your UI? Or is it just a little tweak where you just, it's actually quite easy to do? Quite often we get asked, well, so once I've found these issues, what do I do now? How do I fix them, right? And there it can be really instructive to go back to the facets to inspire fixes. So, for example, if the thing is about, well, I'm risk adverse, right? And I don't want to. I want to know that I'm going down the right way. Then obviously signposting feedback becomes much more important in terms of how to fix it, right? So you would look at the facets and think about, okay, how can I make it so Abby, Tim, or Pat would have an easier time in the way that their cognitive styles work. Okay, so I mentioned this in terms of embedding it into UX and design, so you can use the facets in user research to find out about your target group. So you might actually use the personas not just to recruit for user testing, but also if you're conducting surveys, if you're conducting interviews, try and find out more how your user base is clustered around these particular cognitive styles and facets. Okay. One way that other people use personas is by printing them out as posters and dotting them around the office. So you can print out Abby and Pat and Tim and just display them so they're always in the forefront of your mind. And I already mentioned GenderMag, so if you embed that into your process, if you're using it quite a lot, you can turn it from a 2-hour walkthrough to literally a 5-minute spot check on your design. Okay, so if you have any questions about how to embed GenderMag in your organization, please feel free to ask us for help. As I said, we have worked with a lot of organizations already to see how they used it. If anything is unclear, please come back to us, and we're more than happy to help you through taking it into your own organization. So, you know, we're here to help. Okay. Just to finish up, really, your feedback is really important to us. Thank you again for attending this webinar. We want to hear from you about how this has changed your way of thinking or working, whether you found it useful. Let us know if you implement this into your organization and how and what you have found. And also, if you have any feedback, how we can improve the kit, which is the e-booklet, then let us know. We have gone through various iterations and it just got better and better. After this webinar, we'll follow up with email with you. So we'll send you an email in a few days' time for you to complete an online survey, giving us feedback how this session went and what you were thinking about it. And also we'll include a link to an ebook booklet, which is Making Technology Gender Inclusive with GenderMag, which we also call the GenderMag Kit. So you have much more information available, also a list of resources that you can download. So, you know, that will be coming to your email inboxes shortly. You can also contact us on gendermag.method@gmail.com. And we also have a website, the gendermag.org website, where a lot of information is downloadable. So at this point, at this point, I still have some time for questions.
Yeah, we had a question that has come through from Pearl. I think it's asking for if you've got any particularly common examples that you've come across in your perhaps in your research or your work about technology barriers for gender.
Really interesting. To be honest, I wouldn't know where to start, because in every case that with every organization that we've worked with, in every case we have uncovered gender inclusion issues. So it might range on how many we found. So some organizations, there was a graph very early on, and a team found only you know, they looked at some features and only found gender inclusion issues in 12 of them. Others found in all of them. So, you know, you tend to find different amounts, but usually you find some. What is also really interesting is that using the GenderMag process and approach actually gives you not just gender inclusion issues, but it also gives you usability issues for free. right? So it's better explained in the e-booklet. So if, for example, you found an issue for Abby, but none of the facets applied, this is a good hint that it's actually a usability issue that affects everyone rather than just people who have the same cognitive style as Abby. We tend to find different variations of issues and gender inclusion issues, but there are gender inclusion issues in almost every single technology that we looked at.
Cool. We did have one more question. I'm just trying to decipher. Otherwise, if anyone has any other questions, I think I need a minute just to read this, but I think that was the last question.
Ooh.
Let me just see here. We've got a question about bias in artificial intelligence, depending on I think, Gina, this question is quite complicated, so I think perhaps we try and answer this later on.
Okay, so we've actually come to the end of the talk. So I think if there are any specific questions that you have about GenderMag, then please send them to gendermag.method@gmail.com, or visit the gendermag.org website, or you can actually send me an email, and I'm trying to help you as well, answer any questions that you might have. And as I said, we'll send you a survey as well. And if you have any other issues that you have, you can also give us feedback on that. I think this has been quite a mammoth session. I'm just looking at the clock. I think I have been talking for nearly 2 hours non-stop. But I hope you have learned what GenderMag is all about, how important gender is in technology design, how to find and fix gender inclusion issues. And I really just hope that you embrace what you learned today and go out and use it in your organization. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'll stick around for a little bit longer to answer questions. I noticed a few people here as well that I don't think I've seen for a very long time. So at this point, I just close the sort of formal webinar, and thank you again for listening.